Emma woke up with the familiar knot in her stomach. Another day, another opportunity for Principal Williams to harass her and make her feel uncomfortable. With a sigh, she pushed back the covers and prepared to face the day. She truly loved her job as a first-grade teacher at Washington Elementary. Seeing the excited faces of the children when they mastered a new concept or learned to read a difficult word was priceless. But over the past year, her joy in teaching had been overshadowed by Mr. Williams' constant harassment. At first, she thought he was just being friendly. He would often stop by her classroom and make comments about her outfit or her hair. "That blue dress really makes your eyes pop," he would say. Or, "You look very nice with your hair up like that." Emma knew that technically those could be considered harmless compliments, but then his visits became more frequent. Several times a day he would poke his head in, looking her up and down before smiling lecherously or winking. Emma would blush and look away, uncomfortable but unsure how to confront him appropriately. After all, he was the principal. The compliments also became more personal and hurtful. "Have you considered losing some weight?" he would ask in a conversational tone. "Your backside looks especially large in those pants." Emma would feel mortified, increasing her attempts to wear loose clothing to hide her body. The frequency of Mr. Williams' visits and his offensive comments began to affect her ability to teach effectively. She found herself distracted, nervously glancing toward the door waiting for him to enter and say something inappropriate. Her anxiety and lack of focus didn't go unnoticed by her students. Emma had reported Williams' behavior to the school authorities, but so far nothing had been done. She had the horrible feeling that they didn't believe her, or worse, that they didn't care. Mr. Williams was a pillar of the community. He had run Washington Elementary for nearly a decade and was well regarded by both parents and the school board. As Emma dressed for work, she wished she could simply not show up that day. But she knew she couldn't let Mr. Williams' harassment chase her away from a job she loved. She tied her hair back in a tight bun, put on a long skirt and loose sweater, and headed to school, mentally preparing herself for another difficult day. Upon arriving at her classroom, Emma felt a wave of relief at seeing the smiling faces of her students. Most were already at their desks, chatting animatedly as they finished the breakfast they had brought from home. "Good morning, class." Emma greeted them cheerfully. "Good morning, Miss Emma," the children chorused back. Emma smiled. No matter what happened, teaching was always worth it. As the students finished their breakfast, Emma wrote out the day's schedule on the board. Then she took a moment to study her students' faces, as she did every morning. She liked to catch any signs of distress or unhappiness at home. Children rarely complained outright, but if you paid attention you could often see when something was wrong. Today, however, everyone seemed calm and happy. Everyone except one, Marco, her star pupil and one of her favorites, seemed unusually glum. Normally vibrant and full of energy, this morning he barely touched his breakfast and kept his eyes fixed on his desk. Emma made a mental note to keep a close eye on him today. Just as the bell rang to start the school day, Principal Williams burst into the classroom. Emma stiffened nervously as he gave her a slow, calculating smile. "Good morning, dear," he drawled, his eyes roving over her body. "Lovely skirt. Much too baggy for your figure, I'm afraid." Emma blushed and looked at her hands, mortified. From the back of the classroom, she saw Marco glaring at him with a frown. "Well, I'll let you get to teaching," Williams said cheerfully after a long, uncomfortable pause. "But I'll be back to check on you soon." With a wink, he abruptly left the classroom. Emma exhaled shakily and turned to the class. "All right, let's take out our math books." As the math lesson progressed, Emma felt the clouds of anxiety beginning to disperse. She always felt most like herself when she was fully absorbed in teaching. Today they were working on triple-digit addition, and the students were focused on diligently solving the problems in their workbooks. All except Marco, Emma noticed. The young boy was staring blankly at his math book, making no effort to begin the work. In fact, he hadn't even bothered to open his math book, Emma realized with surprise. That was completely out of character. Normally he was the first to finish all assignments with a proud flourish of his pencil. Emma moved casually between the students' desks, placing a comforting hand on a shoulder here, a word of encouragement there. When she reached Marco's desk, she knelt down to be at his level. "Marco, honey, is something wrong?" she asked quietly. "You haven't touched your breakfast or started the assignment. That's not like the star student I know." Marco looked up, his big brown eyes wide. For a moment it seemed like he was going to say something, but then his expression closed off and he shook his head stubbornly. "I'm fine, Miss Emma," he muttered. "Just thinking about some stuff." Emma frowned, not quite convinced. But before she could press further, a movement out of the corner of her eye caught her attention. Principal Williams was back, leaning against the doorframe as he observed the class with a predatory gaze. "Keep working on those math problems, Marco," Emma said quietly. "I'm sorry, I have to keep teaching now. But we'll talk later, okay?" Marco nodded, but his expression remained blank. Worried, Emma returned to the front of the class just as Williams began another round of inappropriate comments. "How's that triple-digit addition going?" he asked loudly. "You know how important it is to master basic math. Though I have to say, I always found that women aren't very good with numbers. I suppose their brains just aren't wired for it." He chuckled, looking directly at Emma, who flushed with embarrassment and anger. Had he really just said that in front of a classroom full of impressionable students? From the back of the room, she heard a loud metallic clang. Marco had slammed his math book shut and was glaring at Mr. Williams with furious eyes. For the first time in Emma's memory, her model student seemed on the verge of exploding in class. "Marco, honey, calm down," Emma murmured, giving him a pleading look. The last thing she needed was for her best student to get in trouble on her account. Fortunately, before Marco could say anything he would regret, the recess bell rang, breaking the tension. "All right class, put your books away and head out to recess," Emma smiled bravely as the students crowded toward the door. But inside, she felt her courage crumbling. As Emma supervised the students on the playground, she noticed that Marco was keeping to himself away from the other children. Normally he would be running around playing tag with his friends, but today he was swinging alone on a swing set, moving pensively back and forth. Emma debated whether she should approach him. She wanted to find out what was bothering the normally happy boy so much, but she also needed a few minutes to herself. The constant visits and inappropriate comments from Principal Williams had left her exhausted and shaky. Deciding to give Marco a bit more time to work through whatever was bothering him, Emma headed to the teacher's lounge to make herself a calming cup of chamomile tea. As she waited for the water to boil, she contemplated whether she should report Mr. Williams' behavior to the school board again. She had already reported him twice in the past year, after his initial flirtations turned into direct and incessant harassment. But the school authorities had done nothing to stop him. The vice principal, Mrs. Taylor, had suggested that Emma was possibly misinterpreting Principal Williams' intentions, and the head of the school board, Mr. Farmer, seemed primarily concerned that a scandal might tarnish the school's reputation. Emma felt disheartened as she realized the power dynamic seemed firmly tilted in Mr. Williams' favor. Despite having a decade of exemplary service at Washington Elementary, her voice seemed to count for very little. With a sigh, she poured the hot water over the tea bag and contemplated her options. She could request a transfer to another school, but she didn't want the harassment to force her to abandon a job she loved. And besides, if Mr. Williams remained unpunished, who was to say he wouldn't start harassing another teacher? Her conscience wouldn't allow her to stay silent and let other people go through the same horrible situation. As Emma sipped her tea, trying to ignore the nervous trembling of her hands, Mrs. Taylor burst into the break room. Without a word, she began preparing herself a strong cup of coffee. Emma watched her uncertainly. Though they had worked on the same campus for years, they had never had more than brief passing conversations in the staff room or hallways. Their relationship was strictly professional. After adding a scandalous amount of cream and sugar to her coffee, Mrs. Taylor finally looked at Emma. "So," she said in a tone of false cheer. "How are those adorable first graders of yours doing this year?" Emma was surprised, but responded politely. "Oh, quite well overall. Always a mix of challenges and breakthroughs, but I love seeing how." Well, great," Mrs. Taylor interrupted. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that some of the other administrators and I have noticed Principal Williams spends an awful lot of time in your classroom lately." A rock sank in Emma's stomach. Was the vice principal finally going to confront the abusive behavior she had been reporting for the past year? Or was she insinuating something more threatening? Trying to keep her tone neutral, Emma replied, "Yes, Mr. Williams has been making quite regular visits to my class. In fact, I wanted to speak with you about." Of course, Mrs. Taylor said brightly. "I just wanted to let you know that other teachers have expressed some concern that the principal is devoting so much attention to one teacher. It could look like favoritism, you know. Or give rise to certain rumors." Emma felt her jaw clench. "Rumors?" she repeated softly. She knew exactly where this was going. "Look, you're a talented teacher, and I'm sure you haven't done anything to encourage Mr. Williams' interest," Mrs. Taylor said in a tone of conspiratorial confidence. "But gossip can be vicious. I just thought I'd warn you, woman to woman. It would be a shame if your reputation got tarnished somehow." With that, she downed the rest of her coffee and headed for the door, pausing long enough to look back at Emma. "Just be careful about appearances, you know. Perceptions can get so easily distorted." As the door closed behind her, Emma felt tears burning in her eyes. After everything she had endured, now she was being blamed for attracting unwanted attention, insinuating that she was responsible for potential rumors. With shaking hands, she threw the rest of her tea in the trash. She had lost her appetite. As she walked back out to the playground, a sense of crushing defeat settled over her. She was alone in this. The administration was clearly going to protect the harasser rather than his victim. In her rush to leave the teacher's lounge, Emma accidentally crashed into Marco as she rounded a corner. The little boy was standing there alone, his cheeks flushed from the cold and a somber look in his kind brown eyes. "Marco, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention," Emma said, steadying herself. "Recess isn't over yet." Marco hesitated, glancing down the hallway toward the teacher's lounge before responding. I just thought I'd bring you this," he said quietly, holding out a slightly crushed purple wildflower. "You looked sad today, and my mom always likes flowers when she's sad." Emma felt her heart melt at the sweet gesture. "Oh Marco, that's very kind of you," she said, accepting the flower. She gave him a hug, touched by the child's perceptiveness. Clearly he had noticed her distress even before she herself had. "Thank you, sweetheart. This pretty flower did help cheer me up," she said, smiling at him. Then, on impulse, she added in a low voice, "You know, Marco, sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that can make them sad or angry. If you ever see me like that, just remember that it's not your fault, okay? You're one of my favorite students." Marco frowned thoughtfully before nodding. "Okay, Miss Emma. But you can talk to me too if you ever need to. I can keep secrets." Emma chuckled. "Thank you, honey. Now go play, you still have a few minutes of recess left." As Marco ran off toward the playground, Emma walked slowly back to her classroom, twirling the flower in her hands. The child's spontaneous kindness buoyed her spirits and reminded her why it was worth enduring the daily harassment. She needed to focus on her students, not on the poisonous politics and favoritism of the school administration. But when she reached her classroom, her precarious sense of hope crumbled once again. There, rifling through her desk, was Principal Williams. Hearing her footsteps, he turned with a wide smile that didn't reach his cold gray eyes. "Emma," he said with false cheer. "I was beginning to wonder where you'd gotten to. Just popping in to say a quick hello before my next meeting." He closed the desk drawer he had been searching and slowly circled the room toward her. Emma felt her pulse quicken as she backed up against the wall, Marco's flower still clutched in her hand. "What a pretty flower," Williams commented, reaching for it. "Even prettier when you blush. Really brings out your eyes." Emma turned her head in disgust at the unwanted compliment. Why couldn't he just leave her alone? Taking advantage of her discomfort, Williams leaned in even closer until Emma could feel his hot breath on her ear. "Don't pretend you haven't noticed it, Emma," he whispered. "The tension between us. All these little cat and mouse games. Just admit that you like me. Emma felt a wave of nausea at his words. He was so completely wrong, so sick and twisted. Gathering her courage, she looked him directly in the eye. Principal Williams, I would ask that you please not invade my personal space, she said in the firmest tone she could muster. And I am not interested in any kind of relationship outside of our professional roles. I would appreciate it if you would stop making inappropriate insinuations or remarks about my appearance. I just want to do my job without being harassed. There was a moment of silence. William's face briefly twisted into an ugly look before he recomposed his fake smile. My, don't you have to be so formal, he said with a pretend wink. I was only joking. I think someone needs to work on their sense of humor. With that, he backed away and strode out the door just as the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. As Emma watched the students file in, her mind was reeling. She knew she had done the right thing confronting him so directly, but she also had the terrifying sense that this was far from over. From the look in William's eyes, things were only going to get worse from here on out. Over the next week, Emma felt herself sinking deeper and deeper into despair. As she had feared, her direct confrontation with Principal Williams only seemed to intensify his harassing behavior. Now not a single class period went by without him barging in with increasingly perverse compliments or subtle touches that made Emma feel sick. What was worse, the rest of the staff seemed determined to turn a blind eye. Emma would catch other teachers shooting sympathetic glances or shaking their heads in disapproval when Williams crossed the line, but no one seemed willing to confront him directly or speak up in Emma's defense. Even Mrs. Taylor stopped by one day to tell Emma that she was looking a bit stressed lately. Had she considered taking a mental health leave? The implication was clear, the problem was Emma's, not the harasser stalking her every day. Each morning, Emma debated more and more whether she could force herself to go into work that day. She felt tired and nauseous all the time now. Even the prospect of her beloved students' sweet faces could barely cheer her up. She felt trapped in an endless nightmare. The final straw came when Mr. Farmer, the head of the school board, called Emma into his office one afternoon after school. In a grave voice, he informed her that several formal complaints had been lodged that she may be making unwanted advances toward Principal Williams. Now, I'm not taking any sides here, Emma, Mr. Farmer said with false compassion. I just thought you should know. I hope this can help us resolve any misunderstandings that may have arisen. I trust this matter will be settled quickly and quietly. The message was clear: deny it and shut up, or face unpleasant consequences. Emma barely managed to hold back tears as Mr. Farmer smiled tolerantly at her. Then she retreated to her classroom to gather her things. She had lost the will to keep teaching that day. How was she going to get up in the morning knowing that not only would nothing be done, but now she was being falsely blamed? As she walked toward the parking lot, Emma crossed the empty playground. On the lone swing set, she noticed a small figure swinging slowly, staring at the gravel ground. Marco seemed so lost in his thoughts that he didn't even look up when she approached. Marco, honey, what are you doing here so long after the bell? Emma asked gently. Tears began to prick her eyes again at seeing the somber, hurt expression on the child's face. He seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Hi Miss Emma, Marco shrugged evasively, but continued staring at the ground. Just thinking about some stuff. Emma sat down in the empty swing next to him. Sometimes we need to talk to friends when we have big problems, she said. And it seems like we both could use that right now. If I promise to listen, will you promise to tell me what's bothering you? Marco looked up with a startled expression, as if just noticing her presence. Then, to Emma's amazement, his expression hardened with a look of determination that seemed odd on his childish face. I promise if you tell me what's going on with Principal Williams, I'll tell you what's bothering me, he said defiantly. Emma gaped, momentarily struck dumb. How did this perceptive child know something was so wrong between her and the principal? She thought she had hidden the situation quite well from her students. Then, looking at Marco's stubborn chin, she realized with a start that she couldn't deny it. This child clearly already knew something was terribly wrong. And maybe, just maybe, talking to him would help her feel less alone. So with a shaky sigh, Emma told him the long story, the leering looks, the unwanted touches, the obscene comments. How her complaints were ignored, and now she was facing retaliation for daring to speak up. She told Marco things she hadn't even told her close friends, tears streaming down her face. It was a huge weight lifted just to have it out in the open. When she finished, Marco jumped off his swing with his fists clenched at his sides. "I knew Principal Williams was bad news," he shouted. "I heard him talking on the phone about hurting someone who wouldn't do what he wanted, so I started following him around trying to figure out what it was all about. But I never thought he'd hurt you." Emma wiped away her tears, shocked. "Wait, you've been following Principal Williams?" she asked. "Marco, honey, that could be very dangerous. I don't want you putting yourself at risk or getting in trouble for me." But Marco wasn't listening anymore. With a look of fierce concentration, he picked up his backpack from the ground and pulled out a smartphone. "Mom finally let me have a phone this year in case of emergencies," he explained, typing furiously. "So I started taking videos every time I saw Principal Williams doing something bad to show to the police." With a flourish, Marco hit play on a video and handed it to Emma. With a sense of dread, she pressed play and was horrified to see herself on the screen. It was from last week, when Williams had cornered her in her classroom, whispering threats in her ear as she tried to escape. The blurry images and choppy audio were hard to decipher, but the threatening vibe was unmistakable. And Emma realized with a jolt that this was evidence, the first solid proof she had been able to find of Williams' advances and harassment. "Marco, I can't believe you did this for me," she whispered in awe, tears springing anew. This could be enough to prove my case against him. I could finally get him fired and get the justice I deserve. I could be safe." She hugged the startled Marco fiercely, barely able to contain the hope and relief flooding through her. This sweet, brave boy may have found the key to ending her terrible nightmare once and for all. But when Emma and Marco brought the disturbing video to the school authorities the next day, the harsh reality of the situation soon became apparent. The head of the school board, Mr. Farmer, watched the video with barely disguised disdain before dismissing it as blurry footage lacking context. "Come on, Emma. Principal Williams was clearly just joking with you there," he said with a forced laugh. "You don't seriously believe he was making an actual threat or something, do you? You're just overreacting." But he was threatening her. Marco interjected heatedly. "I've seen him harassing her lots of times. He's mean. Why else would he be following her around and bugging her all the time?" "Watch your tone, young man," Mr. Farmer snapped, his face reddening. "I won't have students making such shocking accusations against staff. Now, if you don't have any more proof than some poor quality, out-of-context footage, I think this meeting is over." And with that, he brusquely motioned for them to leave his office, leaving Emma heartbroken and Marco furious. Emma's moment of hope for justice and validation faded, replaced once again by crushing despair. But when she looked at Marco's stubborn chin and blazing eyes, Emma felt a renewed spark of defiance ignite within her. The school may have abandoned her, but she was no longer alone in this fight. And she knew deep in her heart that somehow, someway, she and her brave young ally would find a way to hold Principal Williams accountable. Emma drove home in a state of shock after the turn of events. Not only had the school board completely ignored Marco's video showing Williams stalking, but Williams was now furious that Marco had interfered. As she drove on autopilot to her small suburban home, scenes from the day replayed in her mind like a nightmare, the chilling coldness in Williams' eyes as he dragged Marco out of his office after brusquely dismissing their evidence, the condescension dripping from school board president Mr. Farmer's voice as he chided Emma for making reckless accusations against the respected principal. But worst of all was the feeling of utter powerlessness as she watched the defeated expression on her star student's face as he left the meeting. He had trusted so much that the adults would finally do the right thing. Instead, once again the powerful protected the powerful while dismissing the vulnerable. As she entered her lonely house, Emma kicked off her shoes and curled up on the couch. She felt completely drained, but her thoughts were spinning too fast to sleep. She turned on the TV to fill the heavy silence, seeking distraction from the distressing events of the day. As she flipped listlessly through channels, her phone pinged with an incoming text message. The number wasn't saved in her contacts. Frowning, Emma opened the message. "You shouldn't have shown that video. People could get hurt." Emma felt a chill as she read and reread the cryptic message, her heart rate accelerating. She didn't recognize the number, but it could only be from one person, Williams. He must have gotten her contact number from somewhere in the school records. The fact that he was now contacting her off school grounds filled her with dread. She knew his harassment was wrong, but was this some kind of veiled threat? Would he really hurt other people just to safeguard his position and reputation? Would he hurt Marco, an innocent 11-year-old child? A feeling of panic rose in Emma's throat as her phone pinged again with another incoming message from the same unknown number. With trembling fingers, Emma opened the text. "People sometimes disappear without a trace. Be careful, Emma." Emma dropped the phone, her breathing coming in shallow gasps. This went beyond harassment or inappropriate advances. This was a direct threat to her safety, maybe even her life. Williams clearly held her responsible for the public exposure and was eager to protect his reputation at any cost. Should she call the police? Emma doubted they could or would do anything at this point. There was still no concrete evidence that Williams was sending the threatening messages. They would probably dismiss her concerns as the ravings of a hysterical woman. Maybe she should run, Emma thought wildly. Just get in her car right now and drive as far as she could. But she knew she couldn't abandon her students, and fleeing would only make her look more guilty in the eyes of the school and local authorities. No, for now she would have to be brave, even as every instinct screamed at her to flee from the danger looming ahead. When morning dawned on a new day, she would talk to Marco to make sure he was all right. Then she would go to school as usual, keeping her chin up as she sought allies among the administration and staff. She still had friends there, teachers who respected her work ethic and dedication. Together they could shield against retaliation if Williams tried anything. Slightly comforted by this plan of action, Emma prepared herself a light dinner that she barely touched, her eyes persistently darting to her silent phone, almost expecting it to light up with another threat. When she finally trudged upstairs to go to bed, she was exhausted but afraid of the dreams that awaited her. She woke with a start several hours later, her heart pounding. She had been dreaming that she was wandering aimlessly through the school hallways, a shadowy figure pursuing her, getting closer and closer. Emma flicked on the bedside lamp, trying to regain her composure. It was only 3 a.m., but she knew she wouldn't be able to get back to sleep. After taking a hot shower to calm her frayed nerves, she dressed slowly in the quiet darkness. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when she left and drove through the deserted suburban streets toward the school. The campus was eerily silent when Emma arrived. Even the early rising janitor hadn't arrived to turn on the lights yet. Taking advantage of the stillness, Emma headed first to Mrs. Cahan's fourth-grade classroom. She wanted to check Marco's locker and make sure there was no sign that Williams had followed through on his veiled threat against the student. Glancing over her shoulder to make sure she was alone, Emma quickly spun Marco's combination. As she opened the small metal door, its contents looked reassuringly mundane: a crumpled jacket, some messy textbooks, a Ninja Turtles lunchbox. Emma relaxed a bit, relieved. Clearly Marco hadn't been harmed or intimidated further after the board meeting. Emma gently closed the locker just as the lights flickered on, signaling the start of a new school day. She hurried back to the relative safety of her own classroom before other teachers and students began filling the hallways. She had a lot to think about and plan before facing them this morning. Half an hour later, the first students began arriving, passing by Emma's classroom on their way to the gym for morning assembly. She offered them reassuring smiles, determined to project an appearance of normalcy even as her mind continued to race. Finally, she saw Marco walking by, head down, looking much smaller than usual. She quickly called out to him. "Marco, can you come here for a minute?" Wide-eyed, the boy changed direction and approached nervously. "I'm so sorry about yesterday, Miss Emma," he mumbled, staring at the floor. "I shouldn't have shown that video." "Are you in trouble?" Emma's heart ached to see the guilt etched on his childish features. She knelt down to look him in the eye. "Hey, don't apologize," she said firmly. "You did the right thing. I'm very proud of you for standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Marco bit his lip. But Principal Williams and Mr. Farmer were so angry. I know, sweetie. Sometimes adults react badly when their mistakes are pointed out, Emma said gently. But I just want you to know that I'm not angry with you. In fact, I could use a brave friend on my side these days. Do you think you could help me with that? For the first time, a small smile lit up Marco's face. Yeah, I can be brave, he said, straightening to his full 4-foot height. Then, in an impulsive burst, he hugged Emma tightly. It'll be okay, Miss Emma, he whispered. I won't let Principal Williams be mean to you. Emma smiled through teary eyes as she hugged him back. If she could bottle a child's resilience, all her fears and anxieties would dissipate. Marco reminded her that not all was lost, there was still goodness and integrity in the world, and it was worth fighting to protect it. After Marco left to join his classmates in the gym, Emma sat at her desk with renewed purpose. She turned on her laptop, determined to write her formal resignation. She planned to submit it at the end of the school day. Williams and the school board might want to protect him, but she refused to be complicit in their dysfunction any longer. She would proudly resign before tolerating this situation further. As she finished the letter and printed it out, the first period bell rang. Emma went to stand in the doorway to greet her incoming first graders. As they settled into their desks, she glanced down the hallway as usual. There was no sign of Principal Williams. It seemed he was hiding to avoid an awkward encounter after the embarrassing video incident. Emma felt a small sense of satisfaction as she thought of her resignation waiting for him on her desk at the end of the day. Who has the power now, she thought defiantly. This will be the last time he sets foot in this school. With that comforting thought, she cheerfully began the day's lesson, focusing on basic human anatomy as the students diligently labeled body parts in their textbooks. As the children worked, Emma reviewed her lesson plans for the coming week. There were so many lessons she wanted to get through before leaving: holiday celebrations, art projects, and of course, lots of reading. She would have to work long hours to make sure she left nothing unfinished for her replacement. Emma was so absorbed in reorganizing her plans that she almost didn't notice the growing commotion outside in the hallway. But when a pair of older students ran past yelling about some kind of fight, her attention sharpened. Giving her students the task of silent reading at their desks, she cautiously headed for the door. Outside, an excited circle of students had gathered around something. Emma heard a loud thud followed by muffled grunts and shouts of, "Fight! Fight!" Her pulse quickened as she pushed her way through the crowd to see what was happening. For a moment she stood frozen in shock at the scene unfolding before her. There, rolling around on the floor with fists flying, were Marco and Principal Williams. Emma was stunned. What on earth was Williams doing fighting an 11-year-old child? As she watched in horror, Williams managed to pin Marco's wrists above his head. Straddling the struggling boy, he leaned over him with a wild look Emma had never seen before. A sense of pure terror gripped her. Williams had clearly lost his mind and was capable of anything. "Marco!" Emma screamed, rushing forward. Williams looked up, sweat dripping down his face as he panted heavily. He released the boy's wrists as if they had burned him. He attacked me," Williams gasped, pointing accusingly at Marco. "The little monster jumped me from behind." Emma knelt beside Marco, helping him to his feet. He seemed unharmed but was shaking uncontrollably, his huge brown eyes fixed on Williams with a look of pure hatred that seemed impossible on a child. "Liar!" Marco shouted, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "I saw you taking Miss Emma away. You were hurting her." Emma frowned in confusion. What was Marco talking about? She had been in the classroom all morning. But before she could ask, loud police sirens sounded and two officers burst through the main doors, drawing everyone's attention. "Everyone move aside," the taller officer shouted, shoving curious students out of the way. When they saw Williams and Marco on the floor, both officers drew their weapons. "Hands up where I can see them," his partner yelled. Stunned, Emma raised her trembling hands. What was going on? Why were the police pointing guns at them like they were dangerous criminals? "Officer, I think there must be some kind of mistake," she began, but trailed off as 4 more officers rushed into the hallway. To her horror, they quickly handcuffed her and Williams. "Emma Miller, you are under arrest for the attempted kidnapping and assault of Alexander Williams," the tall officer barked as he roughly escorted her down the hallway. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court." Dazed, Emma let herself be dragged through the school, the handcuffs painfully tight around her wrists. The shocked faces of teachers and students blurred past her as she was led outside to a waiting police car. The last thing she saw before being shoved into the back of the vehicle were Marco's eyes staring at her in horror. Then the door slammed shut, locking her into an absolute nightmare. Emma sat in shock in the back of the police car, her mind reeling. They had just arrested her for attempted kidnapping and assault against Principal Williams. Kidnapping, the very idea was ridiculous. She had never harmed anyone in her life. As the police car pulled away, sirens blaring as it sped through the streets, Emma tried frantically to organize her stunned thoughts. What was happening? And how could she prove her innocence? She recalled Marco's confused words minutes before, just before the police arrived. He had said he saw Principal Williams taking her away, or something worse. But that was impossible. She had been teaching in her classroom all morning, surrounded by her first-grade students. She was never in any danger or even interacted with Williams after her brief encounter with Marco early that same morning. Could Williams have somehow fabricated evidence against her? The idea made Emma's stomach churn. But framing her for a violent crime, that would require resources and connections that Emma hoped even a corrupt principal didn't have. As the police car finally pulled up in front of the police station, Emma felt panic rising in her throat. She needed to think. She needed an ally. She needed a lawyer. Yes, a lawyer. He or she could help her unravel this absolute nightmare. With shaky knees, Emma got out of the police vehicle and was led inside the station by a stern-faced officer. Her handcuffs were removed only long enough to be fingerprinted and photographed like a criminal. Then she was unceremoniously deposited in a small cell to await further questioning. Sitting on the hard metal bench, Emma struggled to breathe through the growing panic attack. She needed to call someone, anyone who could help her. Just as she was gathering the courage to yell and demand her phone call, the heavy metal door swung open abruptly. Emma stood up shakily as 2 detectives entered, their faces grim. The shorter one tossed a folder onto the small table with a thud and sat down across from her. The other leaned casually against the wall, effectively blocking any escape route. It was a classic interrogation tactic, Emma noted with a pang of fear, good cop, bad cop. "So, Ms. Miller, I think you know why you're here," the seated detective began. His badge said Detective Murphy. "Tell us about what happened today between you and Principal Williams." Emma swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Detective Murphy, I assure you this is all just a terrible misunderstanding," she began. "I've been harassed by Principal Williams for months. I even have some video evidence dash." "Ha! She's got evidence," the other detective snorted from the wall. Emma winced internally. Clearly he had already condemned her as guilty. "Go on," said Detective Murphy impassively, his brown eyes unreadable. With still trembling hands, Emma proceeded to tell the whole sordid story, the leering looks, the obscene whispers, the barely veiled threats. She detailed her multiple ignored reports to the school board and her growing sense of fear and powerlessness. The detectives listened in silence, taking occasional notes. "So you see, Principal Williams is the real predator here," Emma concluded, on the verge of tears. "God only knows what lies he's told the police to set me up like this, but I swear to you I would never hurt him, and I certainly didn't kidnap him, for heaven's sake." Detective Murphy leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "It's an interesting story, I'll give you that," he said pensively. "But we have several very credible witnesses who saw you stalking Principal Williams with a weapon this morning before physically assaulting him and attempting to force him to go with you, including one of your own students." Emma gasped. "What? That can't possibly be true. I've been in my classroom all morning. Check the security cameras, talk to my students and their parents, they'll all tell you where I was." The other detective scoffed. "A convenient story. And let me guess, your students will all lie for you. Nice alibi. Emma felt tears of frustration stinging her eyes. No, it's the truth. I never assaulted Principal Williams. She turned to Detective Murphy, silently pleading with him to believe her. But his expression remained unreadable. With another shrug, he stood to leave as his partner pushed off from the wall. We'll wait for the results of the police investigation before pressing formal charges, Murphy said over his shoulder. In the meantime, you'll be staying here until this is all sorted out. Your bail has been set at $250,000 given the severity of the charges. As the heavy metal door slammed shut behind them, Emma collapsed onto the bench, sobs of disbelief racking her body. She didn't have a fraction of that amount. And even if she could, she now had a criminal record. Her career, her calling to teach, it was all over. Her life as she knew it had vanished in a matter of hours. Emma cried until she had no tears left. There had to be a way to prove her innocence, she thought frantically. Someone who could help her escape this twisted trap. Her thoughts turned to Marco. If only she could talk to him, she was sure he could clear up what really happened from his childish perspective. Surely he could convince the police that she would never harm him or anyone. The sudden creak of the metal door made Emma sit up. A different officer entered this time, younger, with kind eyes. You have a visitor, he announced, holding the door open. Stunned, Emma saw a familiar face peek timidly around the corner. Marco, she whispered. She hadn't realized until that moment how badly she needed to see a friendly face. She jumped to her feet and rushed toward him, repressing the urge to hug him. She wasn't allowed physical contact with visitors. But Marco had no such qualms about flinging himself into her arms, sobbing with his shoulders shaking from the force of his crying. I'm so sorry, Miss Emma, he wailed between hiccups. I made a really, really big mistake. But I was trying to save you, I swear. Please, please don't hate me. Dazed, Emma stroked his curly hair as he cried. Hey, it's okay. It's all right, she whispered. I don't understand completely what's going on, but I'm sure you would never do anything to intentionally hurt me. They separated as Marco wiped his wet face on his sleeve. He looked up at her pleadingly. When I saw Principal Williams dragging you forcibly to his car, I panicked, he said in a rush. All I could think was to stop him before he took you away any further. So I picked up a big rock and I hit him in the head with it. He winced at the memory. Emma gaped, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to horribly click into place. Wait, you saw me with Williams near his car this morning? Marco nodded miserably. But Marco, that's impossible, she said quietly. I was in our classroom all morning, quizzing my students on human anatomy. Her voice trailed off as another memory hit her. That morning, while her students were quietly working on an assignment, she had left them alone briefly to check the hallway because she heard a commotion. That's when she stumbled upon Marco and Williams fighting on the floor. A chill ran down her spine. If she really hadn't left her classroom, who had Marco been fighting with? And who exactly had he hit in the head, prompting the frantic arrival of the police? Marco, she said softly. The woman you saw with Principal Williams, did she look exactly like me? Marco frowned thoughtfully. Well, yeah. I mean, she looked like you, but different. She didn't smile like you do, and her eyes seemed cold. Emma inhaled slowly, her mind spinning. Someone had set up this twisted trap, someone who looked enough like her to fool even those who knew her well. And that someone clearly had a lot of influence, enough to manipulate witnesses and fabricate evidence against her. A face flashed in her mind, confirming her worst fears, Vice Principal Taylor. She had the power, the motive, and now thanks to Marco, a head injury that directly linked her to the scene of the alleged crime. And she had made her disdain for Emma's harassment complaints clear in the past. Emma knelt to look Marco directly in the eyes. Marco, listen to me carefully. Mrs. Taylor, the vice principal, have you ever seen her acting strangely or suspiciously? Marco thought, then shook his head. Not that I know of. I mean, she always looks pretty angry, but you're the one I like best. Despite the gravity of the situation, Emma couldn't help but smile at that. She ruffled Marco's hair affectionately. His testimony and absolute trust were like a beacon of light in this terrible storm of confusion and betrayal. At that moment, the young officer returned to tell them visiting time was up. Marco hugged Emma tightly. "I'll fix this. I promise," he vowed before disappearing through the door. Emma sat on the metal bench, her mind frantically working to unravel the disturbing mystery. Vice Principal Taylor had to be behind her imprisonment, maybe even colluding with Williams in some twisted way. But proving her theory would be nearly impossible given the circumstances. She would need help, someone on the outside she could trust absolutely. Someone perceptive, brave, and stubborn enough to unravel the truth. As she knocked on the door to claim her right to a phone call, Emma already knew exactly who she needed. She just hoped they would be up for this impossible challenge, because her life and freedom depended on it. After her emotional visit with Marco, Emma finally received her regulation phone call. With trembling hands, she dialed the familiar number of her neighbor Anna, silently praying she would pick up. "Hello." Anna answered after 3 agonizing rings. "Anna, thank God," Emma exclaimed, nearly crying with relief. She quickly explained her innocence of the absurd charges and her theory that Vice Principal Taylor was somehow conspiring against her with Williams. "It's insanity," Emma concluded breathlessly. "I know it's a lot to ask, but you're the only one I trust absolutely right now. Marco believes me, but he can't do much about it. Please, Anna. I'll do anything to make it up to you, but you have to help me." There was a moment of stunned silence at Emma's explosive plea. Then Anna said in a fierce tone Emma had never heard from her normally placid neighbor, "Emma Miller, don't you for 1 second believe those lies about you. We'll get to the bottom of this and get you out of there. That's a promise." Emma nearly collapsed with relief. She knew she could count on Anna, smart, methodical, and stubborn as a mule when it came to her loved ones. Anna was the perfect ally for this mission. She gave explicit instructions for Anna to call an excellent criminal lawyer known through a friend. Then she had Anna promise to keep her eyes and ears wide open at the school in the coming days. As a substitute mother of 3 kids in the local school district, Anna was well positioned to gather potentially critical information from other sources. After promising to be in touch as soon as she could, Emma ended the call just as the guard came back to escort her to her cell. She felt a little less alone after contacting her trusted friend. If anyone could overcome the seemingly insurmountable obstacles they faced, it was Anna. For the next agonizing 48 hours in jail, Emma barely slept. How could she sleep knowing a twisted conspiracy was ruining her freedom, her career, her life? Time seemed to crawl as she alternated between crying in frustration and angrily kicking the walls, demanding justice. Finally, after what felt like years rather than days, Emma was escorted to a room to meet with her new lawyer. She was anxious and worn, wrapped in the orange jail jumpsuit they had given her after processing. But the moment she saw Anna's kind face followed by a sharp-looking man in a suit, she nearly collapsed with pure relief. The lawyer, Mr. Crawford, turned out to be as sharp and capable as Anna had promised. Within minutes he had Emma's entire timeline and conspiracy theory laid out on the table. He reviewed his notes with a frown, asking pointed questions, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well, this certainly sounds like the framing of a crime," he said thoughtfully after Emma finished her emotional testimony. "There's still no forensic report of DNA or fingerprints linking you to that scene. So in theory, it's your word against theirs." He turned to Anna. "And you're certain that if they investigate the school security cameras, it will prove Ms. Miller never left that classroom like she says?" "Without a doubt," Anna said with fierce confidence. "I've known Emma for a decade. She would never harm anyone, and she certainly wouldn't go running out of her classroom past cameras to kidnap the principal." Her eyes narrowed. "Someone is setting up an elaborate ruse here, and we're going to expose them." Emma felt her heart swell with gratitude. They were on her side, unequivocally sure of her innocence. It was like taking her first full breath since the nightmare began. Mr. Crawford nodded thoughtfully, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He was clearly eager for the challenge of unmasking this criminal conspiracy. He began asking other insightful questions about Emma's potential enemies and seemed especially interested in Vice Principal Taylor. "I'll investigate further, but we have a solid case here to get these absurd charges dropped," he said, standing and picking up his briefcase. "I'll petition for your immediate release on bail this afternoon. Rest easy, Ms. Miller. We're going to fight this." Emma's cheeks were wet with tears of gratitude as she shook Mr. Crawford's hand fervently. She looked at Anna, who smiled encouragingly. "I told you," she stated simply. "Together we're a force to be reckoned with." Emma nodded, unable to speak through the overwhelming surge of emotions. Later that same afternoon, to Emma's delight, Mr. Crawford managed to secure her release on bail. She could finally return to civilization while awaiting the next hearing. Anna drove her straight to dinner to celebrate the small but significant victory. As Emma enjoyed her first restaurant meal in days, Anna updated her on the disturbing rumors swirling around the elementary school. Apparently mysterious witnesses kept coming forward to give sworn statements about Emma's kidnapping attempt, but when Anna or anyone else tried to verify the witnesses' credentials or exact locations, they were notably elusive. "They've all been instructed not to discuss what they saw out of respect for the investigation," Anna said in frustration. "But only a few can give convincing details, and none can explain what they were doing at a certain time in a certain place. Sounds like carefully orchestrated false testimonies," Emma reflected grimly, poking at the remains of her salad. "Surely Detective Murphy has to realize something smells fishy here. Has there been any update on reviewing the school security cameras?" Anna pursed her lips. "Unfortunately, Principal Williams had some technical issues 2 days ago, and the recordings were irreparably damaged." Emma dropped her fork, her hand shaking. She knew Williams and Taylor were behind the witness manipulation, but destroying crucial evidence. She wondered how much lower they were willing to sink to see her convicted and imprisoned. "We can't prove it was them who damaged the tapes since the IT director confirmed the technical problems," Anna continued. "But that conveniently timed destruction surely makes people ask more questions." Even that Detective Murphy seemed to have doubts. A flicker of hope ignited in Emma's chest. If they could sow enough seeds of doubt, maybe the truth would prevail after all. Her mind raced, shuffling through possible plans and approaches to prove her innocence beyond all reasonable doubt. Suddenly Anna's phone chimed, and she quickly checked it. "It's Marco," she announced. "He wants to see you right away. Seems he has important news." 20 minutes later, Anna and Emma met with a breathless and very excited Marco in the park near the school. He thrust a crumpled envelope at them with shining eyes. "I stole this from Principal Williams' desk," he announced triumphantly. "I think it'll help prove Miss Emma is innocent." With trembling hands, Emma opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a detailed invoice from a company called Charlatan Security Solutions, based in the city. It showed an exorbitant charge for their undercover investigation actors' services. "Actors," Emma breathed. "So that explains the false witnesses. This must be the company they hired for those fake witnesses," Anna gasped, reading the invoice over Emma's shoulder. Her eyes blazed with fierce triumph. "We have our proof of conspiracy. A jury will never be able to ignore this." Emma grabbed Marco in a fierce bear hug. "Marco, you are absolutely incredible," she cried, spinning him around. His joyful laughter was like music to her ears as hope bloomed in her chest. Surely this would convince even the skeptical Detective Murphy that there was a monstrous criminal plot at work. Later that night, Emma was finally able to sleep deeply for the first time since her imprisonment, a smile still on her face. She knew she still faced an uphill battle to fully clear her name, but with Anna as her tenacious investigator, Mr. Crawford providing excellent legal representation, and Marco as her brave and cunning ally, she felt like nothing could defeat them. The truth would prevail because together they were stronger than the lies and corruption currently imprisoning her. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she couldn't wait to see how things played out with the explosive new evidence in play. This nightmare was almost over, she could feel it. On the courthouse steps the next morning, Emma breathed in the fresh morning air and felt it like freedom. Today, after a tortuous week in jail and the lingering cloud of false accusations, her name would finally be cleared. Beside her stood her 3 fierce defenders, lawyer Mr. Crawford, who carried the briefcase with the damning evidence, Anna, whose fierce glare could melt steel, and Marco, nearly unrecognizable in a suit and tie but with his stubborn chin in place. Emma smiled fondly at them. Together they formed an unbeatable team. Inside the courtroom, Emma scanned the crowd, wondering if the conspirators would show up. If they had any shred of conscience, they should admit defeat now that their wicked plot had been exposed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar face seated in the back of the gallery, and her stomach churned. Vice Principal Taylor, her hawk-like eyes glaring at Emma with pure hatred. Emma inwardly shuddered but kept her chin high. She wouldn't let this evil woman intimidate her ever again. Taylor's lies about her would crumble here today, once and for all. The judge entered and proceedings began. Mr. Crawford quickly petitioned for all false charges to be dropped, presenting the incriminating invoice from the fake witness company as irrefutable evidence of Taylor and Williams' plot. Detective Murphy looked visibly surprised and promised to investigate thoroughly. Then Emma was called to the stand. In a clear, firm voice that betrayed none of her inner nerves, she recounted the events as they happened from her perspective, without exaggeration or conjecture. She detailed dates, times, and witnesses who could corroborate her activities and whereabouts on that horrible day. When she finished her moving testimony, the courtroom remained in complete silence. Even the judge seemed moved. Emma held her breath. Would this be enough? Suddenly Mrs. Taylor stood up. "Objection, Your Honor," she shouted. "This woman is clearly twisting events to cover up her own wickedness. I demand that these absurd accusations against school staff be dismissed." The judge shot her a withering look. "Ma'am, this is my courtroom. You will allow me to rule on this case as I see fit." He banged his gavel firmly. "All charges against Ms. Miller are dropped immediately." Emma nearly collapsed with relief. Anna and Marco cheered loudly, only to be admonished by the bailiff. Even Detective Murphy smiled and raised his eyebrows with an "I knew it" look before leaving to investigate Vice Principal Taylor. But Taylor clearly had no intention of giving up. "That woman is the real criminal here," she screamed, pointing wildly at Emma. "She's the one who's been seducing staff and trying to ruin the school." Her voice rose to a hysterical shriek. "I won't let her get away with it." Before anyone could stop her, she pulled a gun from her purse, aiming it directly at Emma. Panic erupted in the courtroom as people screamed and ducked. "Everyone stay still or I'll blow her brains out," Taylor yelled, her eyes with a crazed gleam as she slowly walked toward the witness stand with the gun trained on Emma. Emma couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Time seemed to slow as she stared into the deadly black barrel of the pistol. "Is this how it ends?" she thought weakly. After surviving the twisted conspiracy, she would be murdered right here in the courtroom. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a blue blur moving quickly. It was Marco, stealthily approaching Taylor from behind with a look of absolute determination on his young face. Before she could cry out a warning, Marco leaped, clinging to Taylor's back like an angry monkey. The woman screamed, thrashing wildly but unable to reach the tenacious child. "Run, Miss Emma!" Marco yelled, not letting go despite Taylor's best efforts to dislodge him. As if coming out of a trance, Emma jumped down from the witness stand. The bailiffs moved quickly toward Taylor while she was distracted, disarming and tackling her. Emma ran to Marco, who was lying on the ground sobbing but unhurt. "Marco, you're so brave," she whispered, hugging him tightly as the bailiffs handcuffed a hysterical Mrs. Taylor. "You saved my life. I can never thank you enough." Tears streamed down her face from retrospective horror and overwhelming gratitude. Later, after the commotion had calmed and Taylor had been formally arrested, Emma sat on the courthouse steps, enjoying the beautiful sunny day. She felt euphoric and light without the cloud of false accusations oppressing her. Anna and Mr. Crawford were inside finishing paperwork to definitively close the case. Marco walked slowly toward her, hands in his pockets, kicking at some pebbles. "So, you're not in trouble anymore?" he asked shyly. Emma laughed through tears. "No, I'm not in trouble anymore. Thanks to a certain very brave and quick-thinking young man I know." She hugged him again, expressing all her gratitude without words. After a moment, Marco lifted his head from her shoulder. "You know what that crazy lady said about you seducing the staff? That's not true, right?" he asked with a frown. Laughing and crying at the same time, Emma assured him it wasn't true, not even close. "Evil people sometimes tell horrible lies when they're desperate," she explained. "But you know the truth about me. That's what matters." Marco nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he pressed on, "So, since you're innocent in everything, will you be my teacher again now?" He looked hopeful, and Emma's heart melted at his warm brown eyes. She hesitated. After all this trauma, she wasn't sure she could continue at Washington Elementary. Those hallways now held too many painful memories, and it wasn't clear if the deeply rooted corruption had been fully eradicated. But seeing the desperate plea on Marco's face, Emma knew she couldn't abandon him. They had been through too much together. He needed stability and guidance during this formative time, and being honest, she would need his bright, positive light to fully heal as well. So with a growing smile, she told him, "You know, Marco, after the week I've had, one thing I do know for certain is that I want to keep being your teacher. What do you say, partner? How about we tackle this school year together? You teach me about being brave, and I'll teach you about multiplying fractions. Deal?" Marco's hopeful smile was like the sun coming out. Hugging her tightly, he said, "Deal." And Emma knew that no matter what challenges they faced in the future, together they would be unstoppable.